So last week we spent a good chunk of time thinking about recognizable characters, giving your characters the psychological depth needed to motivate the decisions in believable ways, and the necessary ground for them to have significant meaningful change by the story's end. Now this change is squishy. The changes they make might be that they're worse by the end of the story than when they started. You don't need to give your character a moment at the end of the story where they say, I learned something today. Unless you're writing like an after-school special or something. But in most forms, that explicit epiphany isn't really needed for your character. It is needed for your readers, but we'll get to that later. This week, I think it would help to expand our thinking on character to include some of the deeper psychological structures that make up personality, and to address the larger mythic archetypes that inform character creation. Again, it helps to remember that advice on creative writing is really new. People have been writing stories forever, and we never needed a class on how to do it. How did Tolkien or Austen or Shakespeare or Homer or anybody write characters? Two ways. They watched people and they read stories. The more we do those two things, the more we start to see patterns emerge in how people interact, what motivates them, what sorts of things they fear or avoid. Wait a second, time out. This is really important. We're going to be talking about some general structures of consciousness, and for a long time, people have applied those general ideas to real living folks. That's dumb. Human psychology is far more complex than any ready-made system can account for. These things are useful for fiction writers, but they're less useful for understanding your neighbors or loved ones or even your hated ones, and especially yourself. Our conversation today does not qualify you to be someone's shrink, far less to be someone's judge. Okay, time in. To grossly oversimplify, when we see these patterns in figures or myth or literature, we call them archetypes. When we see them in real people, we call them personality types. Carl Jung is a big figure in the background here. Jung, you know all this already, was one of the leading voices in establishing psychoanalytic theory. A protege, friend, later rival to Sigmund Freud, Jung formalized much of our understanding of the subconscious. For Freud, human self-identity emerges from the interaction of two forces. One, the primal bodily urges of our libido, fears, desires, the famous 4 Fs, feeding, fighting, fleeing, reproducing. The other force was rational, organized requirements that arise when living in a society. Morality, law, duty, things I owe other people, things I must do to live at peace with my neighbors. This force Freud called the superego. The other he called the id, or the subconscious. These two forces don't always see eye to eye. They usually don't, in fact. The things the id wants, consumption, gratification, preservation, are restrained by the dictates of the superego. Societies can only function when there are shared expectations about safety or security, ensured rights, protections. So I'm caught. I have to fulfill my instinctual desires, but for my own well-being, I also need to remain in good graces with the social order. As a result, Freud says a third force appears, the self, the I, or the ego. This is the conscious mind that wills and acts, and those wills and actions are designed to navigate between the desires of the id and the requirements of the superego. What's the best way that I can both fulfill these instincts as well as inhabit society? The mentally healthy I finds a way. None of this stuff's really true, by the way. Turns out Freud wasn't very good at reading humans, but he was good at reading literature. This stuff doesn't work for real people, but it's all over literary characters. You know, not real people. Freudian psychoanalysis has this huge impact in literary study, but really his only lasting contribution to the world of psychology was that human minds have this thing called the subconscious. Jung's development of the subconscious has been far more influential. For Jung, the subconscious itself is something like a structure, or maybe a propensity to have certain structures made. I mean, it's not quite like we have an innate set of a priori ideas about fathers or Fisher Kings or something. It's more like we have the hardware set up to configure a specific kind of software. We have placeholders for things in the subconscious. When we encounter stuff in the world, images, sounds, abstractions, affections, people, language, our subconscious files those into these shapes and patterns. These patterns take on narrative arcs and character types that Jung called archetypes. The subconscious isn't just some chaotic free-for-all of lust and self-gratification. No, the subconscious is organized. I like this idea. It means that our brains are built for stories. And it means that the stories we tell, for Jung, emerge from the storehouse of characters, plots, images. These archetypes not only find their way into our stories, they also populate our dreams. And everywhere you find people, human minds with a subconscious, you will find echoes of those subconscious structures. This doesn't mean that all minds are identical or that all stories are merely spasms of our subconscious. Every culture and every person in that culture populates these forms with their own sense of identity, their own experiences. This means that we can look at any story and find an archetype in the DNA someplace. And obviously, to call that faint structure way in the background the most important part of the story clearly misses the point. So as to character, Jung, and really more of Jung's followers here, give us a few basic archetypes. Here's a stupid list. The child, the sage, the explorer, the outlaw, the sorcerer, the hero, the lover, the jester, the everyman, the caregiver, the ruler, the creator. Hi, me again. Just to be clear, these aren't archetypes exactly. Remember, the archetype is more of a structural propensity for organization in the human mind. Rather, think of these as common representations of archetypes as they'll appear in literature or art. Okay. Now, every one of these figures performs a basic need of the subconscious. Freud is still partly right, Jung thinks. The subconscious is the home of the most basic drives, desires, and fears that we have. Once we add the structures of archetypes to the mix, we can glom on to each figure some of those basic drives. The child has the need for safety. The sage, the need for understanding. The explorer, the need for freedom or unrestrained action. The outlaw, liberation. Sorcerer, power. Hero, mastery. The lover, intimacy. The jester, enjoyment. The everyman, belonging. The caregiver, service. The ruler, control. The creator, innovation. Now, each of these drives can be distilled down further to four main desires. First, to become spiritually enlightened or fulfilled, or to become famous, or to engage in genuine social connection, or to live in meaningful structures. Sometimes this list is framed as a mandala. In this configuration, you can see the opposites make for some really well-known character types. The jester sage is a really common feature of Shakespeare's tragedies, for example. The sorcerer king, Sauron, president business, makes for a pretty common villain. The outlaw caregiver is an old Western trope. The everyman explorer and the artist hero are some of the most common protagonists in modern literature and film. But there's another aspect to Jungian psychology that might help us add another level of nuance to our characters. For Jung, again drawing on Freud, the elements of the subconscious are kept in check by the self in order to appease the superego and live peaceably in society. A healthy psychology makes these navigations with no problem, but there are still aspects about ourselves that we must keep pushed down beneath the surface. That subterranean self Jung calls the shadow. The shadow enacts all of these desires the self has, but can't express. For Jung, it's essential for us to encounter the shadow and reconcile ourselves to them, to recognize that it's part of us and accept that its desires are our desires, but desires we have willingly renounced. The shadow therefore contains the greatest threat to my self-identity. If it gains the upper hand, it will unravel the truce between superego and id. But it's also the key to the self gaining complete control over my entire subconscious. In regard to archetypes, then, the shadow represents the potential ways a character can go wrong. This typically works in two ways. The shadow can either fail to fulfill the fundamental desires of the self, or tries to fulfill them in ways that become self-destructive and socially deconstructive. Let's look at our stupid list again. The sage's need for understanding, for example, is rooted in a need for spiritual enlightenment. Well, that can go wrong in two ways. Either the sage pursues enlightenment at the cost of his own soul, or he fails to gain knowledge altogether. On the one hand, we get Faust or Victor Frankenstein, a very tragic figure. On the other hand, we get the dunce, more in line with slapstick comedy or harlequinade. So Gandalf, the sage, Sauron, the shadow. The ruler enacts a fundamental need to construct meaningful systems of order and organization, but that can go wrong when the ruler forces those systems of control for their own aggrandizement as the tyrant, or fails to have the moral strength to do what's right, the weakling, or the fisher king. Simba, self, Scar, shadow. Or the caregiver, the fundamental need is service, specifically in order to maintain structure and meaning. This can go wrong with the helicopter parent, brooding over every move of their child, or it could go even further wrong with the abusive or absentee parent. Toni Morrison's Beloved comes to mind as a particularly complex example of this. Writing with an archetype in mind can be incredibly daunting. It's not something I would recommend. On the other hand, knowing this kind of stuff can be really useful in two places. First, in revision, looking back at the story and finding key points. And second, in overcoming blocks. Sometimes we get stuck when we're writing. We don't know what should happen next or what the character should do. We really don't know what the relationship is between this character and another. Thinking in terms of archetypes can be helpful in these situations because they suggest some of the underlying basic motivations that characters might have, or suggest some of the ways they could be coming into conflict. More importantly, recognizing an archetype in your writing might also be a great opportunity to start building in literary and mythological allusions. There's no new idea, everything is old news. Knowing what stories our stories intersect with can give us a chance to steal ideas from those mythic storehouses. If you think Star Wars, The Lord of the Rings is original, I got bad news. If you think Romeo and Juliet or Frankenstein were original stories, sorry to burst your bubble, man. These are old, deeply old, mythologically old stories. Seeing how our characters participate in these ancient constructions can enable you to put a new face on an old god. There's a lot more to be said about character and personality, but that'll have to wait for the next one. Give it a look then. Okay, bye!